We are going to begin the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2020, organized by the Ministry of Unification, and we're going to talk about the conditions for sustainable policy toward North Korea. I am Kyung Hoon, and I am Director of Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at SNU. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for joining us despite having to have this session online. This session will be conducted in Korean mostly, but you can also listen to the English interpretation online. This session will deal with politics, security, and politics and socio-cultural aspects of sustainable North Korea policy, and we want to hear from distinguished speakers from Korea who have a lot of expertise on North Korea-related issues. First of all, I would like to introduce the presenters and discussants. So I would like to ask the discussants and the presenters to wave their hands when I call out your name. First of all, we have Dr. Byung-yeon Kim from SNU and Dr. Jae-sung Chun from SNU. And Dr. Haeran Shin, also from SNU. These three speakers will be presenting. And then I would like to introduce the two discussants. From SNU Graduate School of International Studies, we have Professor Chul-hee Park. Good morning. And Dr. Jung-hoon Han, also from the same graduate school at SNU. So these two gentlemen will be providing the discussions. So let me briefly talk about how we're going to conduct today's sessions. The presenter should speak within 20 minutes, and the discussants, I would like to give each maximum 15 minutes so that they can cover their questions and also comments for the presenters. And the audience, you can utilize the QR code to post your questions. So if you submit your questions using the QR code, our staff and myself, within the time allowed, will select some questions which will be delivered to the presenter so that we can hear their answers. And after that, we will have each presenters respond to those questions, and I will give each presenter 5 minutes. So the presenters and also the discussants if there are certain issues that are raised outside of your designated subject, even if that's the case, please freely respond. So we would like to have more of a free exchange of ideas. I think that would make our session more productive and constructive in terms of gathering the wisdom that we need to improve relations with North Korea. Now, first, we will begin with Dr. Kim, and then Dr. Chun, and then Dr. Shin in that order, as is indicated in the program. So, Professor Kim, please continue. Start your presentation.
Hello, everyone. I am Byung-yeon Kim from Seoul National University Department of Economics. I would like to share my slides with you for the presentation.
네, 오늘 제가 말씀드릴 주제는
So today I'm going to be speaking about North Korean economy and peace on the Korean peninsula. In order to review the relationship of the two, I would like to ask this question. Does peace facilitate economic activity? The answer to this question will be definitely yes. Then, that is because the economy requires peace. Then, does the economy lead to peace? The economy is a condition to lead to peace. However, it does not necessarily lead to peace. Therefore, there's a tendency that economic development leads to peace. In Europe, before the European Union, there was cooperation on economy and coal trade. And this led to the European Union being established. So economic activity and peace are connected. That is because if the economy is connected with one another and if there is integration, then this leads to more peace. North Korea's denuclearization is a condition for peace on the Korean peninsula. However, this is not enough. Nuclear development and ICBM development is a need of North Korea, but for this to be eliminated fully, there has to be opening and reform of North Korea's economy. It has to become connected to the global economy for it to give up its development of nuclear weapons, for it to curb its desires to develop such weaponry. And in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about reform and opening of North Korea's economy. North Korea's reform and economy opening up. To discuss this, we have to talk about the future. That is because we cannot say that North Korea has already entered reform and opening. But we think that we can see some starting of opening and reforming. And that is related to the market within North Korea. North Korea has changed greatly. If we call the 1980s of North Korea the Stone Age, then I think now North Korea's economy has entered into the Bronze Age. It will not be a stretch to say this. And I feel that such changes are irreversible and fundamental changes. I drew North Korea's economy in a form of a house. If we depict it in this way, on the roof, you will see that it looks as if it's a socialist economy, but actually the two pillars that hold up the economy is the market and trade. So North Korea is living off of trade and also the market. Of course, this is before the sanctions. North Koreans, out of their income, 70% of it comes from market activities. For a 4-people household in North Korea to live, they need on average $40. But the salary that North Koreans receive through official jobs is around 3,000 won. And there is a black market existing in North Korea that does the exchange of this, and this would be about 40 cents. So then the remaining portion that is required to live is made up through activities in the market. And those who work in official jobs, it's about 50%, but those who are engaged in market activity is about 70%. So what are the activities that they carry out? It's actually quite diverse. For example, some may be involved in raising livestock and farming. That was in the initial phase. And now they are involved in selling food, and they do brokerage, handicraft, retail, food selling, brokerage, smuggling, and foreign exchanges. So all sorts of businesses are carried out by North Koreans. So in one sense, North Koreans have the most sellers. And Adam Smith said that merchants, in his book, talked about a nation of shopkeepers, that country has a lot of shopkeepers. And I think that North Korea at the moment has a lot of shopkeepers. So now there are markets that sell and trade consumables, but there's also businesses that trade with one another. And also, there is personal and private financing, funding, and loaning. And there are individual, like brokerages, such as realtors. And there's a particular name for the real estate brokers in North Korea. So this is having an impact on the labor market of North Korea. Then the question that we can ask would be as follows. The marketization of North Korea, will this lead to market reform and opening? Will it trigger and drive change within the North Korean economy? So the reason why I am asking this question and raising this question is because I feel that the North Korean regime itself will not voluntarily reform and open itself. To move on from a socialist system to a planned economy, rather from a planned economy to a free economy, there are some factors that led to such transition. And the first one is the change in the leadership. So the political leader that has changed, when that leader feels that opening and reform will strengthen one's regime, there is opening of that regime. Unless that condition is met, they will not open up. And even if there is reform, it is limited to a socialist type of reform. That is the political constraint. So the political leader will weigh the pros and cons of opening up to one's power. And only when this helps the dictator there will be opening up. And so North Korea, therefore, there's a low possibility that there will be voluntary opening up and reform. Of course, that would be the best option. And as there was moving from the medieval times to the Renaissance industrialization, we see that the market led to a compromise of the power. And this led to commerce, and it also led to a industrial society. And there are many factors that led to this. And when you diagnose the reasons for industrialization, you will see that industrialization led to changes in one's value sets. Adam Smith comes from Scotland. And in Europe, the country that had the best ethics is UK is second, and Scotland is the lowest. And that is because the Netherlands had developed, was number one, and the Netherlands had developed commerce the most, and that is why this led to high ethics, is his diagnosis. And recently, Hirschman also agreed to this. So commerce leads to norms, and it changes the value sets of people. Also, structurally speaking, the market and the power might have to compromise with one another because they are closely related. And as the market grows, it will eat into the official market. And this may lead to, in the long term, reform that starts from the roots. Then, in other socialist countries, why wasn't this possible? And there is a unique aspect of North Korea. If you look at the Soviet Union, the households earned money from the unofficial market too. But what was earned through the unofficial market was only 16%. But North Korea, the unofficial market, the unofficial economy accounts for 70% of North Koreans' income. Therefore, in North Korea, this portion is very big. So there is that difference in scale, and such quantitative change may lead to qualitative change. And that is the question that I am asking. So will the power in North Korea absorb the situation and change by themselves? But if you look at the policy of Kim Jong-un, it does not meet the level of China's 1987 reforms. They do not want to reform their economy. They want to embrace parts of the free economy into their socialist system. And however, the norms and value sets of North Koreans are changing, and I feel that this is a crucial point. So to explain this, we can see individualism arising due to marketization. So individualism is about creating one's own space, and in one's own space, what is most important is one's profit and loss. And as the market develops, anonymity increases. Therefore, the values of a groupism becomes in conflict with individualism, and this was experienced in Europe and also in Korea. In the longer term, North Korea's homogeneous groupism will be changed to a homogeneous individualism. In North Korea, there was an ideology, 주체, that combined the homogeneous groupism, and there's individualism. And so these people have a value set of individualism. And the human that is perceived according to 주체 ideology and according to individualism, economicism, it's different. The purpose of life is different, and economic activity is also different. In the past, North Koreans wanted to be loyal to the group and to ideology. However, North Koreans these days, their purpose in life is to improve the material welfare of themselves and their families. And when you survey the defectors, 70% of them, when asked to select what is important, the country, group, or themselves, they answer 70% that it's themselves. Also, economic activity, it was about, according to 주체, is about following orders. And in the political attitude, it was unconditional obedience. Unless it goes against one's so it's unconditional. However, for the economic human, it's conditional. So in certain cases, if what is being ordered goes against one's interest, then they might rebel against it. I have researched North Korean defectors, and I feel that such changes are taking place. The marketization of North Korea and the value set changes have been studied. So socialists, they put importance on non-competition and equality, equal distribution. So everybody gets the same wage. And when there was a survey on the defectors of what do they prefer, whether they want performance-related pay or whether they would like equal pay. And this was connected with the support, this was linked with the support of a capitalism. And we see that there is a meaningful difference in those who participated in market tea or not. So the green, light green, shows South Koreans, and the x-axis is support for market economy. So the South Koreans support market economy, but the second group of people who support capitalism is North Koreans who participated in market economy, and those who support socialism, it is those who did not participate in the market, and then second who participated in the market, and North Koreans, rather South Koreans. So this means that in quantitative terms, in North Korea, if you experience market activity, then if you consider South Korean support for capitalism as 100, then those who experience the market are in between, about 40%. So it is close to the South Koreans. They are into North Korea, but they are supporting capitalism about 40%, and it is happening in North Korea through the market. And this is the graph that depicts this. And marketization also leads to a concept of ownership. People feel that they have ownership of certain materials. And we did a comparison of South Koreans and North Korean defectors. We asked them to play a game. And for the money that they owned, how much are you willing to share with others? That was tested. And on the other side, what you earned and what others earned was put into a pool. And how much money are you willing to give out of that pool to others? We played this game, and South Koreans and North Korean defectors showed a clear difference. South Koreans, whether it was in the pool or whether it was their individual income, they felt that this money was theirs. But the North Korean defectors, it was completely different. For what they earned, they would not give to others, but for the income that's in the pool, they were more willing to give to others. This table is a bit complicated, but those who participated in the market is similar to the attitudes of South Koreans. Regardless of the source of the money, once it is in their hands, they feel that it is their money. They feel that there is ownership of property rights. So we can see that through marketization, the awareness of property rights is increasing. And those who participated in the market, in particular, who have experienced selling in the market, trust others more. Trust in socio-economics, we understand that this helps in economic development, and also it leads to social stability. Those that participated in the market and sold in the market, you can see trust increasing by 27%. And this means that this may lead to public opinion being formed in North Korean society. This will weaken the official propaganda of North Korea. Once you have experience selling in the market, you understand that the market works. So through repetitive market activity, you are establishing relations with others that you did not know. And this leads to a building up of a sense of trust. In addition to this, those who participated in the market, they see an increase in human capital. And as a dependent variable, and also as a proxy variable of human capital, those who participated in smuggling when they come to South Korea are better in adjusting by 20%. And this shows that North Korea, and this is the level of income increase of those who stayed in South Korea for 4 to 5 years. So in now North Korea, the defectors who participated in the market, once they come to South Korea, they adjust very well as if they have lived in South Korea for 4 to 5 years. This shows that this has led to improvement in human capital. What implications does this lead to? So right now, the economy is difficult due to sanctions, but there has to be continuous reform and opening, or else the economy in North Korea cannot continuously grow. As the marketization advances, the dictator has to decide, am I going to fight against the market to maintain my power, or do I need to compromise with the market and give up some of one's power in order to maintain dictatorship? So that decision needs to be made. In North Korea, it might lead to a phase in which such decisions need to be made. If the dictator fights the market, then there will be resistance from the citizens, and there might be a sabotage of the middle ranking leaders because they receive profits from the citizens. and the market. And so dictatorships' opportunity cost will increase, which means that in the long run, our alternative can be marketization from below. We need to lead this to a transition and reform from below. Will such marketization from below lead to reform from below? And this is a big consideration in our North Korean policies. Thank you. Professor Kim, thank you very much for your presentation. Next, we will be hearing from Professor Jae Sung-jeon of Seoul National University.
네, 안녕하십니까.
I will give you 20 minutes, please. Thank you. Good morning. Is the screen visible? My topic is ROK and U.S. policies on North Korea to address the DPRK nuclear issue and security dilemma. So I will cover a range of issues. I don't think your screen is being shared. It seemed like it was being shared, but it just disappeared. So let me try this one more time.
네, 북핵 문제.
So the North Korean issue is at a stalemate, and North Korea is proposing a lot of requirements of the U.S. and international community. So I would like to go over the current issues around North Korea, and I would also like to talk about the security guarantee which North Korea is demanding. Right now, let's look at the essential problem of North Korea. There is the divided Korean peninsula, and there is also an issue of sovereignty competition between South Korea and North Korea. So who is going to be the one with the initiative when it comes to reunification? And so this is the crux of North Korean issue and also the North Korean nuclear issue. And so the North Korean issue and the North Korean nuclear issue is part of the sovereignty game between the two Koreas. And the North Korea continues to demand the security guarantee, and because they want to maintain their regime. South Korea and North Korea joined the UN at the same time, but since then, North Korea, in a way, was given some recognition for its sovereignty, but they feel that their regime is not given full security assurance. And until 1992, there were North Korean policy on North Korea engaged by South Korea. For example, Korea was able to form diplomatic ties with China, and all of that has affected North Korea's situation in the world. And international politics has evolved very quickly. And the international politics, the shift of it has been affecting North Korean issues. So right now, it's not about the Cold War competition, but there is more of a hegemonic competition between the U.S. and China. And so North Korea, an issue, is part of the geopolitical issue involving China and U.S. So even if North Korea is able to successfully denuclearize and be recognized as a normal state, it would be exposed to various shifts in the international politics. And so perhaps the bigger question is what the situation will be even after North Korea potentially denuclearizes, because there are other risks that affect the overall relations. So Trump has pursued a number of solutions which have had some positive outcomes. For example, it highlighted that denuclearization and security guarantee for DPRK should be pursued in parallel. And also there was a recognition of the new U.S. DPRK relations and the need for U.S. approval of DPRK. And right now, the U.S. still has a dominant say in North Korean issues, although there's greater recognition of the importance of solving this issue in the international community. And also there is increased awareness in the international community of the need for DPRK to become a normal state. And also there is some sort of a prospect for economic rewards for North Korea post-denuclearization. And also South Korea has assumed a more enhanced role in all of this. However, there are still challenges remaining because there is still a difference in opinion about what constitutes denuclearization between DPRK and U.S. So on the one hand, U.S. is calling for a complete denuclearization, whereas North Korea is more along the lines of arms reduction. And DPRK has not fully declared its nuclear program, and the United States continue to require that there be full disclosure. So there are these differences in opinion. And also with regards to the negotiations taken on by President Trump vis-a-vis North Korea, there is significant lack of trust within the U.S. itself. So that's another stumbling block for resolving the North Korean issue. And also, Korea needs to play an important role. So Korea must engage in a more effective diplomacy with U.S. And we really need to look at whether Korea has indeed been effective in serving as a mediator between the U.S. and North Korea. And also there is a competition between the U.S. and China, and since China still wants to be considered a partner and ally of North Korea, so there is strategic competition between the two countries with regards to North Korean issues. And also, the Chinese leader proposed a new type of great power relations to define the U.S.-China relations. And there is a tendency towards hyper-competition between the two countries. So in 2020, U.S. has been trying to strengthen its alliance with South Korea in order to check the influence of China in the region. And because North Korean issue is part of this broader U.S.-China competition, there is a lot of influence from China that enters into the equation. And in July, if we look at the statement made by the first vice director, Kim Yo-jong, we can kind of get a sense of North Korea's strategy. So if we look at some of the statement, first of all, North Korea wants to have an overarching and longer-term U.S. strategy. And it feels that, of course, the strategy involving President Trump is important, but it wants to look beyond that. And so North Korea wants to set a more longer-term strategy which looks into even the next administration in the U.S. And also, it's not just about the withdrawal of the economic sanctions. It really wants U.S. to withdraw all its hostile policies against North Korea. And so North Korea emphasizes that it's not necessarily economic rewards or compensation that's important, but it really wants to have security assurance from the U.S. And in North Korea's view, U.S. has engaged in a very long-term hostile policy towards North Korea, and DPRK wants a withdrawal of that. And it wants to have a new relationship with the U.S., and this does not just mean military relationship. It also wants more politically different relationship with the U.S., and this requires greater trust between the two countries. So South Korea, what can it do in having the U.S. withdraw the hostile policy towards North Korea is very important because this is not possible just by strengthening inter-Korean relations. South Korea really needs to work effectively with the U.S. in order for U.S. to be motivated to withdraw its hostile policies towards North Korea. So going forward, it is important for South Korea and U.S. to work together to come up with some sort of guarantee for security of the regime of North Korea. And there needs to be more detailed action planning to provide this. Because DPRK has demanded that there be a guarantee of its regime security as a condition for negotiations. So, we will see a different kind of negotiations that need to take place going forward. So what are the key things that are required for guaranteeing the security of North Korean regime? Actually, North Korea has shifted in terms of what it feels is the security guarantee. First of all, North Korea wants to be recognized as a normal state and be recognized for its sovereignty. And secondly, North Korea also wants at least a passive security guarantee of U.S. refraining from preemptive military strike against it. Because DPRK continues to be suspect of U.S. intentions to potentially preemptively strike. So there needs to be at least a passive security guarantee in that regard. And thirdly, another aspect of the security guarantee is to have some provision of assistance to keep the current political, economic, and social regime intact and recognize its legitimacy. So it wants assistance and also a recognition from the international community of its legitimacy. And so, but also we need to think about there is certain limitation to what international community can do in order to ensure that North Korea's legitimacy is maintained. So we need to look into this further. And also, DPRK wants that there be some sort of a security guarantee for the Kim family, even in a situation where North Korea's sovereignty and regime changes. So the security guarantee that DPRK is seeking is very multi-level because it's at the level of state, level of military security, at the level of regime, and also of the individual and the Kim family. So this is not a very easy guarantee to provide. And especially when there is such low political trust between North Korea and the U.S., the DPRK continues to up its demands for a security assurance from the U.S. So given the fluctuating international politics environment, these demands may shift over time and present greater challenges going forward. And so DPRK wants physical security to be provided by the U.S. And this is because North Korea feels they cannot trust U.S. And so this can be interpreted as a demand for what academically is called the audience cost. And so North Korea wants to have U.S. provide very strong commitments to guaranteeing its security. And sometimes they call for a removal of the nuclear umbrella. Sometimes it calls for withdrawal of the nuclear arms from Guam and in Northeast Asia. And so the guarantee of security that North Korea is demanding of U.S. is not fixed. It actually fluctuates and it changes depending on the political situation at the time. And what about the U.S. response? On the one hand, if the U.S. Actually, the U.S. focuses on denuclearization as part of this non-proliferation agenda, and this has been the approach of the Republicans and the Hawks, and also Democratic Party seems to recognize this more as a broader political issue. So my advice is that U.S. must see the nuclear issue as a political issue concerning the status and the security of North Korea in order to have a comprehensive negotiation with North Korea and achieve some meaningful progress in denuclearization. So going forward, what efforts should U.S. make in order to pursue this denuclearization? The U.S. Should not just look at the Korean Peninsula issue as a denuclearization issue, because even if denuclearization is achieved, the Korean Peninsula and its relations with China should also be considered, because that affects the overall geopolitical situation in the region. So, for example, if after denuclearization, the Korean Peninsula tends to lean towards China more than towards the U.S., this could mean a geopolitical loss for the U.S. So the overall calculation about the pros and cons of this for the U.S. gets very complicated. So there are a number of challenges that U.S. faces in providing security guarantee to North Korea. In international politics, providing military or physical security of the regime of another state is actually impossible, practically speaking, because there is no transnational regime that governs the entire international community. The international community itself is, at that level, it does not have a government that oversees everything. So even if the U.S. were to provide a guarantee of security for North Korea, that's just a treaty. It's relative. It's like a piece of paper, as the PRK puts it. So the more important thing is to have an absolute relationship of trust and friendly relations, but everyone involved, including the DPRK, knows that relationship is very variable over time. So it's even if the Trump administration were to agree to a security guarantee for North Korea, it would be very difficult for it to be more of a lasting commitment. And so perhaps one option for the U.S. at maximum could propose a congressional resolution that stipulates some sort of non-aggression and peace treaty. And even if some sort of peaceful relationship is built for the time being between North Korea and U.S., if there is some Kim factions in North Korea that calls for democratization, then U.S. may be incentivized to support that faction in the North Korea, which would undermine the security of the current regime in North Korea. So there are these variabilities. And even if the U.S. provides military security, the security of the regime internally is actually not possible just by having some external, forces assisting the current regime. So North Korea must have some sort of a certainty as to the soundness of their regime, and unless that is ensured, what external guarantee could mean, is relatively limited. And the countries like Pakistan and Israel who have nuclear power, they have a cooperative relationship with the United States. And not because U.S. provided a guarantee of security of the regime, but because they share some core interest. For example, with India and Pakistan, they have been partnering with the U.S. in the fight against terrorism, and Israel is an important partner in the Middle East. So they share these core interests with the U.S. So despite having developed nuclear weapons, they still maintain a friendly relationship with the U.S. So unless there is some sort of geopolitical interdependence between North Korea and U.S., a guarantee of North Korean security provided by the U.S. Cannot have more than a formal significance, and it cannot last unless there is some meaningful interdependence between the two countries. So one alternative is to perhaps have North Korea play a different role in the U.S.-China relations. For example, in the competition with China, U.S. wants the Korean peninsula to remain pro-American. And so the United States, actually there are a minority of people who actually propose that North Korea could be utilized as a partner or at least a neutral state when it comes to the U.S.-China competition in the region. So perhaps North Korea could be utilized as that check against China. But then, of course, China will be very opposed to this. And also on the Korean side, we need to look into whether ultimately that having North Korea be a partner to the United States be beneficial in terms of its own interests. And also resolving the problem on the Korean peninsula could potentially serve as a good example that can be replicated in solving the third world issues by U.S. So this could help the reputation of the United States as a leader, and that aspect should be emphasized in order for the U.S. to be motivated to approach this from a more meaningful stance. And so Northeast Asian countries, together with the U.S. and the overall international community, should provide more comprehensive guarantee of security for North Korea. And also, I would like to talk about this strategy for stable peace concept that's proposed by a scholar, which can be useful in understanding the relationship with North Korea and U.S. Right now, they are at phase one, and each wants for the other to unilaterally accommodate its own demands. So the two countries start to accommodate each other's demands and try to achieve peace. So in this situation, Korea needs to understand that even after denuclearization, the peace will not immediately come. And so there needs to be a phased approach to providing guarantee for security. And that phased approach should be taken by Korea and also the U.S. So denuclearization is often seen as a step that would be achieved after a complete security guarantee is provided, but that is actually impractical. And so we need to have a phased approach, and we need to develop policies that can help secure the North Korean regime. And there needs to be multilateral efforts. And with regards to the geopolitical interests of the neighboring nations, we need to develop logical arguments that suggest the benefits of building peaceful relations on the Korean Peninsula, and that it can be positive for all the countries in the region. And after denuclearization, Korea should also recognize its potential role as a middle power to engage in effective diplomacy, and South Korea should be able to emphasize this with the neighboring countries in the region. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Chung, for your presentation. It's a very complex issue, very multi-level in its aspects, and there are various variables that are intertwined. And thank you very much for outlining all of those variables and the issue at hand. Thank you very much. Next,
We will be hearing from Professor Hae-ran Shin. Hello, everyone. I am Hae-ran Shin from Seoul National University, Department of Geology. Today, I'm going to be talking about cultural conditions on civil society exchange for inter-Korean social integration, North Korean defectors, assimilation, and transnational geopolitics in a third place. You might wonder why I am studying North Korean defectors and why I am reviewing North Korean defectors. Unification may happen suddenly, and there might be a sudden exchange. However, in the shorter term, it will be exchanges in a small amount, and there will be those coming from North Korea, and South Koreans may conduct business in North Korea more and more in the meantime. And for sustainable integration, what do we need to do? And there is social and economic differences of North Korea and South Korea. So are we prepared to bridge the differences? That is a question that I want to answer. And North Korean defectors should not be viewed as a special group. Maybe we should view them as immigrants, and we can draw some implications by studying immigrants. And others are also researching North Korean refugees living in North Korea, Canada, US, and Korea. And many researchers are looking at the North Korean defectors living in these various countries. And the biggest group lives in UK. And so UK has become a popular destination for North Korean refugees, and that is why many people have settled there. And we try to understand North Korean defectors and settlement by reviewing how they live in South Korea. However, there are some limitations there. We only consider North Koreans coming to South Korea, and when South Koreans can go to North Korea too. Also, the portion of South Koreans versus North Koreans is so big here in South Korea. It's 5,000 to 3. Therefore, in such cases, it's not really of an exchange. The North Korean defectors in Korea are unique, but if you go to the London Koreatown, the portion of North Koreans and South Koreans is 15 to 1. Some say that it's 20 to 1 or 30 to 1. Therefore, the North Koreans and South Koreans living in London have to interact with one another in their daily lives, and it has been covered in the media. The North Korean refugees living in New Malden. So it is known that it is the biggest North Korean refugee community in the world. And before I go into the gist of my presentation, I wanted to introduce this to you, that the assimilation theory was a dominant theory in the immigrant theory. So if you go to Rome, you have to follow the rules of the Romans. It means that the immigrants, once you go to a certain area, you have to assimilate into that society for you to be successful. For example, Koreans living in the United States, they tried to forget Korean language even at home. But in the 1990s, there was continuous research into this area, and except for a couple of situations, assimilation did not take place completely. The immigrants maintained their identity of their original country, and in some cases, it's even strengthened. And as we talk about multicultural, now an alternative to assimilation theory has become transnationalism. In the immigration theory, if you talk about assimilation theory, you might be viewed as someone that has discrimination toward other races. But still, many countries still want to pursue assimilation. So they hope that immigrants coming into their country follow the norms and rules of that country. So as a more flexible policy, they talk about social integration. And assimilation theory and transnationalism, however, it is not in conflict with one another. They can be intertwined, and they can work together. And it is not just about individual being assimilated. It can be re-territorialization. So in the daily lives of these immigrants, the concept of the territory is reestablished, and it's constantly changing in the making. And in that sense, North Korean refugees deterritorialization needs to be viewed. A nation's territory and a country's identity is constantly being negotiated. I lived in UK up until 2013, and I started the field research in 2011, and I conducted the North Korean defector study in 2014 and 17. I carried out a lot of participatory observation and in-depth interviews. I also carried out in-depth interviews into LA in the United States. Those living in UK New Malden, these people are North Korean defectors that lived in South Korea briefly, and then they went to UK. The reason why they left South Korea is because they felt that they were forced to assimilate into the Korean society. One interviewee said that Korean societies are asking North Korean defectors to do something that not even South Koreans themselves can do, and they continuously help you out and wait for you to adjust. Also, when I went to Hanawan, I lived in Hanawan, and on the very first day, they pushed me to become a Christian. And if they are saying that I must become something, then South Korean society is no different from North Koreans. So that is why they left from South Korea, and they went to New Malden. And therefore, when they went there, they were more assimilated into society, and this led to a transnationalism being established. And there are various reasons for North Koreans living there. And initially, those living in New Malden were living in they were native Koreans living in China that came to New Malden, and they were working in various fields such as serving, cleaning, and cooking. And then these people were, while they were working with the employers, which were South Koreans, adjusted to the South Korean method. And there was one interviewee that said, who was a North Korean defector, that says that if we all leave, then South Korean businesses cannot be run because they are working with one another. And for example, one barista at a coffee shop is a North Korean and another would be South Korean. And so they were interacting with one another in their daily lives, but the group activities were different. There was a South Korean group in New Malden, and this group was benchmarked by the North Koreans to create their own group. And also North Koreans would participate in South Korean group activities. And North Korean defectors did not push or show and expose their identity as North Koreans. As they were trying to forget their identity as North Koreans, I could see that they were trying to blend in with the South Koreans, but at the same time, as time passed, in the labor market and in group activities, as these North Koreans were meeting and interacting with the South Koreans, they felt that they were different from them, and they decided to make their own unique group. And as they were making their groups, they were strengthening and their identity as North Koreans, and you would see a re-emergence of their identity. And if you look at this picture on the left-hand side, top picture, this is the Democratic Peaceful Unification Advisory Committee, and you will see the North Korean defectors' children carrying out a performance. And the Korean Elders Association is like one of the major groups there, and they are helping out with this performance of the North Korean defectors. And then on the lower hand, left-hand side, it is the Hanbok event. And so you will see that North Korean defectors in squares and in the circles, it's South Koreans. And those sitting on the middle table, they're South Koreans. But it was a North Korean event. So there's a lot of exchange between South and North Koreans. Do they all enjoy such exchanges, especially South Koreans? They don't like it when there are too many North Korean defectors coming to their events, and they were opposed to this. But what's interesting is that such voices cannot be accepted because the Korean Elders Association said that as their official members, North Koreans should be invited. And the reason for inviting North Koreans is that if there aren't North Koreans participating in South Korean events, it doesn't work because South Koreans don't come to their own events. So South Koreans, they don't come to their own events, and the North Koreans, they come out and have performances, carry out performances. They're very active in those group activities, and they're very active in helping out, lending a helping hand to the preparation work. In 2007 already, there were in 2017, rather, that there was a North Korean defector that was included in the board member of the South Korean Society and the Democratic Peaceful Unification Advisory Committee as well. So there was a lot of discussions about the joint events and what the governance should be for these events, and such discussions are ongoing. Regarding North Korea, in the past, there wasn't a lot of discussion on North Korea, but from 2014, we could see some visibility in the discussions of North Korea and the second generation North Koreans. That's become an issue too. So the North Korean refugees, when they came to UK, they had many children to receive welfare, and they are now going to school. But the second generation North Korean refugees cannot communicate with the first generation because they're speaking in English. And are they going to live as Britons, or are they going to return back to North Korea once North Korea changes? So there has been a discussion on this, and many North Koreans are still sending remittance to North Korea, and in order to send money to North Korea, they have to talk with their brokers there, and they still have those ties with North Korea, in other words. And the organizations and groups of North Korean defectors in the beginning, they would work with the South Koreans and they only try to learn from the South Koreans. But now they are trying to have their own representation, especially for arts and cultural activity groups. There were a lot of conflicts internally with the Korean groups, and so during that time, the cultural groups started to grow, and Korea's arts and cultural organizations do exist, but North Korean performance is unique, and that is why there's a lot of requests for them to come and to perform. And this has led to an increase in their capacity and capability. And what's interesting is that there were discussions like this. Is South Korea the bigger brother? Whether in daily lives or in the events, a high-ranking member of the Democratic Peaceful Unification Advisory Committee would say that South Korea is the bigger brother and North Korea is a younger brother. And North Korean defectors would view South Koreans as the bigger brother. And they would say that South Korean groups should set an example because you're the bigger brother, and the Korean group should be better. But these days now, North Korean defectors, just because you're wealthier doesn't necessarily mean you should be the bigger brother. These opinions are now starting to arise. And for the second generation, North Korean defectors are having concerns, and they created their very own North Korean Language Institute for their second generation in UK. And they have their identity as North Koreans, and they're trying to maintain that. This is a concept of transnationalism that is visible right now. And there was this interview that I had, and they said that we feel we need to have at least one thing that is unique to us. I asked, why are you operating this separate North Korean language school? Because there was already a South Korean language school, and it receives government support. And it's far away, and you have to pay for the tuition. But on Saturday, they borrow a church space to provide North Korean language education. However, there were some that answered that they felt that if we come assimilated into society too much and into South Korean society, we will lose our identity. So we are now hearing to new versions of stories. And my child went to this language institute for 6 months, and my child was the only South Korean going there. And as a parent of the child, I spoke with the other parents, and the other parents were saying that I didn't like the regime, but I still love my country, and I feel that I'm about to burst into tears when I see our flag. And so they try to bring more parents on board, and they have a textbook. They try to create a textbook that's not South Korean or North Korean. And at this church place, they have these tables to have North Korean language education. And regarding this school, there's a lot of expectation and also a lot of conflict around this school. That is because for the future, for South, North, and North Korean defectors, this school led to those who dream of going back to North Korea. And there are others who want to be sound members of Britain and yet to maintain their proud identity as one who came from North Korea. And some are offended or feel uncomfortable about this school being operated by South Koreans. And the students, children of this school were to be invited at a certain event, but this was canceled. And those who are offended feel that the school should be integrated because inter-Korean relations are sour. And in that situation, why should there be division even here in UK? And therefore, there has to be integration. Through such cases, what we could think about and the implications that we can draw from this is that individual lives, it's about being assimilated in a certain location, but it's not just about that. A nation's identity and geopolitical power is also played out in those situations, even in the individual interactions. And that's why there is a hierarchy created there. And when we view the North Korean defectors during unification, if we consider the wave of immigration and new settlement, we should consider policies that are not strong assimilation, but more on sustainable integration. We need to be more sensitive, have a long-term perspective, and in social integration, it will require patience and time, so we should make preparations early on. That's the implications that we can draw. Thank you very much. So in a unified Korean peninsula, we should think about social integration, and you tried to do international comparative studies of immigrants living in other countries, such as UK and US. I'm sure that you will be receiving questions on this, and we hope that we can hear more from you through the Q&A session.
토론 선생
So we have two discussants today. So intentionally, we did not assign a particular discussant to a particular presenter. We wanted a more multidisciplinary approach to discussing the presentations, and we wanted to hear from different perspectives coming from different disciplines. That's why we have discussants who will be commenting on the three presentations rather than addressing their comments to a particular presenter assigned to them. So I apologize for not giving you enough time despite asking you to comment on all three presentations, but I will give 15 minutes each. So perhaps, Dr. Park, you can go first. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Lim for inviting me to this very important forum. I studied a lot about DPRK, and I have a great interest in DPRK, and I was able to gather a lot of different insights that I was not aware of before, so I appreciate that. And I think hearing the presentation actually helped a lot in understanding the different aspects. First of all, Dr. Kim, I have a very deep respect for Dr. Kim's work, and Dr. Kim always looks at the concrete data when it comes to discussing North Korean situation. So it's his qualitative approach is very useful. And I think in the beginning you mentioned a very important issue, the relationship between peace and economy. Does peace promote economy? And he said yes. And does economy promote peace? And he said the relationship is relatively less than the other way around. And I think that's a very significant insight, and perhaps you could further elaborate on this going forward. North Korea is de facto making a transition towards a market system. And also, you talked about how the individuals in North Korea is becoming more market-oriented. That's actually a common knowledge amongst the scholars, but I think the general public are unaware of this, and that the informal economy is over 70% of the overall North Korean economy. It was an important qualitative information. But, this ends my positive comments, but as a devil's advocate, I would like to ask some questions. First of all, you talked about the change of values of North Koreans. And there is the 주체 ideology proponent, and they are people who are shifting toward more economic agents. So when the informal economy takes up 70% of the economy, I think that's a natural course of things. But at the same time, if we look at the character of the North Korean regime, North Koreans, I think, are destined to become more a hybrid type of individual. So on the outside, they have to be proponents of the 주체 ideology, but in essence, in practical terms, they need to live as economic beings. And so, Dr. Kim, you characterize the DPRK's regime as a one-person dictator regime. Well, that is predatory in nature. It has to be. And the government, the state, has the full control of the life and death of the individuals. So as individuals in North Korea, I don't think can live fully as economic agents, because on the outside, they have to look like proponents of the 주체 ideology. So when we talk about this, to say that North Koreans have become more homogeneous individuals and that will help opening of the country, I think that's too positive or optimistic, because North Koreans, can they enjoy an opportunity to really reveal their true economic aspect or economic agency? I don't think there is that kind of an opportunity available. So the change in the values of North Koreans, I'm sure, is taking place internally. But for this to play out, to be visible outside, will take a long period of time. And so I would like you to comment on this. And secondly, there was you talked about the North Korean defectors, and you talked about the value change of the North Korean defectors, and this group has been relatively exposed to capitalism more than the other North Koreans who stayed inside to begin with. And so they have this willingness to take risks, maybe stronger than those who remain in North Korea. So Albert Hirschman's, to cite Hirschman, loyalty, voice, and image, existence, I think they actually chose existence. So the North Koreans, of course, they're North Koreans, but the change of values, could the North Korean defectors actually represent the change of values of all North Koreans? I mean, it's, they do provide some sort of a lens to look into that value change, but to say that North Korean defectors represent the value change and this acceptance of capitalism of the overall population in North Korea. So I think you could, if you could, please comment on this as well. And thirdly, in closing, you talked about marketization from below. I think that's a very important insight. But in the formal economy is recognized, but not institutionally. So actually, there is the lack of institution that allows for this to sort of exist, and the government is just acquiescing to it, but not fully recognizing it. So if you look at the collapse of Soviet Union, the Soviet Union's, informal economy was maybe like 46% only, so that was much limited. But Solnik wrote about the stealing state theme. Well, with such growth in informal economy, I think there might be a reverse situation. So there may be a stealing the market rather than stealing the state. So the current regime could potentially steal the market. And even though there may be more corruption in this informal market, the current regime might actually leverage it and let it be. So by that, that's what I mean by stealing this market rather than the state. And for the next speaker, I would just go right into the devil's advocate questions because of time limitation. The July 10th statement by Kim Yo-jong brought me a shock because she proposed the withdrawal of hostile policies against North Korea as a prerequisite for beginning talks again. So this is a call for to actually propose this as a requirement for talks is really raising the bar to beginning the talks. So what North Korea means by withdrawing hostile policies, what they think of withdrawing the hostile policies, what of their ideas can South Korea and U.S. actually accommodate? I think, you talked about the potential withdrawal of U.S. troops and also the, withdrawing of nuclear weapons from Northeast Asia. There are a number of things which are very fundamental to maintaining the order in the region. So although such measures could help promote security of the regime for the North Korea, but those measures will significantly destabilize the security of the entire region. So could South Korea actually accept those, measures? So, what is the kind of guarantee of security that DPRK is willing to accept and be satisfied with? And you talked about, the security of regime internally. I think that's always fundamentally limited. DPRK, of course, as a state, wants to be confident of the stability of its regime, both internally and externally. And they feel that nuclear program is an insurance for them, so they have no incentive to get rid of it, because that is their last means of maintaining some sort of leverage. So, of course, all experts acknowledge that North Korea is disincentivized to give up its nuclear program. And so there is the security dilemma. So on the other side, if, how should South Korea maintain its security of its regime? I think on the one hand, security of North Korea is very important in these talks, but how about South Korea? How can we maintain and ensure security of South Korea? And about the third presentation, not assimilation, but I actually am for the views that you have proposed. If we want to go towards the transnationalism, you first have to have an environment where you recognize and acknowledge the multiple identities that people can have. But the dilemma here is that, on the one hand, there should be North Koreans who need to be proud of their North Korean identity. But if you have some sort of a shame about this identity, that will make it difficult for North Koreans to assimilate and also be transnational beings. So do you have some sort of a suggestion as to how this limitation can be overcome?
Professor Chori Park, thank you very much. Next, we will be hearing from Professor Han. I am Chung Han. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I learned a lot from the interesting presentations. And I would like to thank Director Kyung Im of IPUS for giving me this opportunity. And I'm from the Graduate School of International Studies at SNU. Because Charlie Park gave us a lot of insights into the presentations, I would like to try a different approach. And on DPRK and unification, if I know anything about it, I think it's on the institutional side and ways for unification. So I would like to focus my attention on those areas. First of all, there's a lot of discussion on peace on the Korean Peninsula and unification. And this is based on South Korea's step-by-step and gradual unification. So I'm interested in whether it is related to this gradual integration. And then in society and in our economy and in our culture, how can we maintain a peaceful system that goes toward unification? The various proposals, when should they be implemented? In which stage of the unification, that is? And so that will be my basic viewpoint when listening to the presentations. On the three presentations, I felt that out of the stages of unification, I think that you are concerned about the stage of cooperation and reconciliation, and that there is a phase of a political, like a community created. And when we talk about unification on the Korean Peninsula, many people think of a complete unification and a united situation. So it's confused. And when we are creating a community, that is unity that is created. And there is also like a unification committee. So that is before the unification, actual unification. And so there would be some confederation type of phase. And when something has been determined, I think the Korean government is preparing for such a confederation before we go on to unification. And the three of you are considering the phase of reconciliation and cooperation before the confederation phase. And security-wise, you are thinking of creating institutions to have continued security internationally and also on the Korean Peninsula. So the first question that applies to all three of you, and one person talked about, the professor talked about marketization and assimilation, and another professor spoke about transnationalism and assimilation for social integration, that this will contribute to peace on the Korean Peninsula. And I think the assumptions for both of this is based on the concept of spillover, that economic and social cooperation, once that is enhanced, naturally it will lead to enhanced political cooperation. So there are such assumptions there that there spillover effect, and such spillover effect we see in Europe that unless there is political will there, such spillover does not happen. And so when there is discussions on social and economic integration, how are we going to link that with political and institutional systems for a confederation stage? We have to link that with such discussions, or else it will not ensure sustainable and continued peace on the Korean Peninsula. So social and economic institutions, what will be needed for that, and what methods or policies should be utilized to maintain that. So I wonder about what institutions you are considering to enable more sustainable integration. And as an alternative, you excluded political aspects in your presentation, and I think that we cannot exclude on our discussions on integrating North Korean defectors and ways to facilitate economic exchange, and also on the various North Korean strategies toward North Korea. How can we pressure U.S. and so forth? In that area, we need diplomacy, and that is diplomacy of lawmakers. So the activities of lawmakers, especially in countries such as Japan and the U.S., individual lawmakers' activities are very important. And Korea's lawmaker diplomacy is required. But in Korea, institution-wise, we lack systems to support lawmaker diplomacy. And when there is a change in administrations, we see that certain stances and certain positions completely change. And the National Assembly is the administration plus the opposition party combined. So when the government continuously changes, administrations change, lawmakers can have more consistency because there isn't changes depending on which administration takes office. And Professor Chun talked about competition, and when governments change, the stances change. In Korea, too, North Korean policies constantly change according to the administration that took the office. So instead of representing and voicing the opinions of a certain party, there should be consistency in the framework toward North Korea. Externally, North Korea's market economy should be supported and should contribute, and a role that Korea could do will be beyond just beyond the efforts of the Korean government, but it should be through institutions and systems that have been decided through the consensus of Korean society as a whole. And in that sense, lawmaker diplomacy is the first thing that comes to mind, and it can be implemented. But at the moment, lawmaker diplomacy is very limited, and it can be further supplemented, I believe. And once lawmaker diplomacy, once it is facilitated, it can be established as an institution, and we need to make considerations for such preparations.
Thank you very much for the two discussants. In the beginning, as I mentioned, we have 3 presentations, so I would like to give 5 minutes each for the presenters to respond to the comments and questions. There were many questions and comments that were raised, so each presenter could maybe choose the most important questions to respond. Dr. Chun has many questions, So I would like to summarize those questions. First, in your presentation, you talked about the U.S. For the U.S. to provide a security guarantee to North Korea is rather difficult. So does that mean denuclearization is also very difficult? And if complete denuclearization is very difficult, and doesn't that mean establishing a lasting peace on the peninsula and in the region a very difficult thing? So in this situation, is it possible to actually have some trust building in a meaningful sense between the U.S. and DPRK? And so in such a challenging situation, how should Korean policies towards North Korea and U.S. DPRK relations be formulated? So that was the essence of the questions posed to Dr. Chun. And Dr. Park and Dr. Han, I did not tell you this in advance, but you also are doing very important research in your disciplines. So since you're here, I actually have some questions for you too, since we have you online today. But I will give you maybe 3 minutes each to respond to my questions. So now you will be able to respond to questions rather than just ask questions. So when we first planned this session, the focus was to create how to create conditions for sustainable policy toward North Korea. Well, from Korea's perspective, there is the diplomatic aspect and international aspect, and then on the other hand, we have the local aspect, internal, domestic aspect. And Dr. Park talked about how, Dr. Park, the current difference in opinions and division between Korea, U.S., and Japan, how should we overcome these differences? So I'm sure you have many thoughts on this. So how can we overcome these differences in opinions between Korea, Japan, and U.S. with regards to dealing with North Korea? And also, you are doing a lot of survey on the perception of the people. So over the years, you probably have more insights into the public's perception. So in forming a sustainable North Korea policy and creating a broader social consensus to support such policy, what are some challenges in achieving this consensus, and how can we overcome those challenges? Because this is a very big problem, and I know it's very difficult to respond to these questions in just 3 minutes each, but please do so. And for Dr. Kim, and also Dr. Chun, you have a lot of questions already, so I'm not going to add any further questions. To Dr. Shin, you have done international comparative study with a focus on North Korean defectors. And this, of course, can be meaningful in preparing for reunification. And we need to have some policies for social integration, better engaging the North Korean defectors here in South Korea. Now, within South Korea, what is the situation of the North Korean defectors in terms of the level of social integration? And what do you think about the policies that are intended to promote social integration of the North Korean defectors here in South Korea? So if you could comment on that too as you respond. So now the order of response will be Dr. Kim, Dr. Chun, and then Dr. Shin, and Dr. Park, and then last but not least, Dr. Han. So that will be the order of the responses. I think we might go over time a little bit, but 5 minutes and 3 minutes for the discussants. Thank you.
박철희 교수님,
Professor Han and Professor Park, thank you for the questions. This might be related to the study area of Professor Park. But I realize that those who have an in-depth understanding of a certain area understand the areas of others very well too. So you provided keen insight into my presentation. In my presentation, the 주체 being transiting to an economic being was explained, and you said that actually these two can coexist. That's a hybrid being instead of one transiting to another. That is true because the defectors, they have a unique aspect. South Koreans, their behavior and the belief sets, their values are the same. But defectors, their actions and their beliefs might not coincide. So even though they support capitalism, it does not impact whether the defectors will give money to others. So there is a departure and separation of their beliefs and their actions within socialism. It is true that we have not seen the reform from below. And so if that takes place in North Korea, it will be unprecedented. So realistically speaking, it may not be easy. And so although I raise the possibility of this, I do understand that it may be difficult, but it might be possible for this reason. The market is like yeast. And when people want to earn money, they try to earn money more. And things that get in the way of earning money, they will use various means to overcome that, whether through bribery or other ways. And in the process, the market will expand and grow. During Kim Jong-un era, participation in the market grew by 10 percentage points. So unless it is forced, the market naturally grows quantitatively. And if this takes place continuously, it will lead to political changes, and it will lead to some cracks in their systems. So they're trying to create a equilibrium, but according to theory, it's a fragile equilibrium. So it is on the appearance, it has a equilibrium, but the dynamism, due to external forces, this equilibrium might be broken, such as sanctions and COVID-19. These are external factors which may shake up the equilibrium. And such external shocks and also internally, if there are continuous changes in the dynamics, then the equilibrium might tend to shift or become imbalanced. And center selection is an issue that cannot be resolved. But the effect of the market, it depends on the type of defectors. Out of the defectors, those that participate in the market and those who did not participate in the market. So the sample selection, whether that can represent the North Koreans, that selection was a bit different, and those that have defected from North Korea, of course, are more risk takers compared to those living in North Korea. Therefore, we utilized the risk-taking and risk appetite as a variable, and we control that variable. And in the sample selection issue, 70% of North Koreans are participating in the market, and 70% of their income comes from unofficial market activity. So on the issue of sample selection, external, like overseas organization also did a survey, and a U.S. institute did a survey of markets in North Korea, and once again, the results were comparable, similar to our results. And the North Koreans living in China, when they were surveyed, it was also aligned with what was found, the findings of our study about the participation in the market and a level of income coming from unofficial markets. On the third question, the middlemen, will they steal the market? Is there a possibility of the middlemen stealing the market? It is possible, but those receiving the bribe, they do not kill their host, because once they kill their host, they no longer can get the bribes. So, first of all, they have this coexistence relationship with those who pay the bribes and those receiving the bribes, the middle-ranking officials. So North Korean officials, if they take the market from those that have been giving the bribery, there will be resistance. And the market is not institutionalized at the moment. And if the mid-ranking officials try to operate the market on their own, it will not be easy. So they will try to have arm's length with the market and get indirect briberies, money through briberies, instead of they themselves becoming operators of the market. So the market activity and the citizens, bribery, and the mid-ranking officials have a coexisting relationship. On the question that Professor Han raised, it is true that I looked at the North Korean market and marketization level. That's closely related with South Korea's economic cooperation activities with North Korea. And as you have asked, all countries, for the economy to be integrated, the institutions, economic institutions of the two have to be similar. There has to be syncing of those two. So there has to be efforts to create the institutions. Then how are we going to connect North Korean market with inter-Korean economic cooperation? There has to be the political will. But Korea's inter-Korean economic cooperation efforts, it doesn't seem that they have the will to integrate the market. They are more nearsighted, and they are trying to achieve the targets and performances that they can achieve in the shorter term. Therefore, there needs to be political will to make that possible with the denuclearization. And as we resume inter-Korean economic cooperation, there should be smarter inter-Korean economic cooperation utilizing the market so that there can be interaction between the two, creating a synergy effect that leads to integration of the two economies. Once the marketization leads to activity of inter-Korean economic cooperation, this will lead to pressure within the North Korean society. And in the first phase, the first thing that we need is, such as Hong Kong and China relation, we need something like an FTA with North Korea for market integration, and further on, the economic input to integration can be created, and then EMU may be established, and this will be appropriate for gradual unification compared to a sudden unification. And in that sense, such transition through marketization is a long shot. It's a long-term activity. So in the short term, what we need to resolve is the denuclearization issue. And as Professor Han said, I completely agree to the need for lawmaker diplomacy. I have met senators and congressmen of UK, rather the United States, and they don't know about DPRK's economy. They think of it at the same level of the 1970s and 80s. And when I tell them about the advancement in the market in North Korea, they are very surprised. So what Professor Chun and I are saying that the current snapshot of North Korea's economy should be communicated to decision makers within Washington politics.
전재성 교수님.
Dr. John, please respond to the questions. Thank you very much for very good questions. in the interest of time, I would like to sort of lump questions together in my response. Dr. Park talked about the Korean security. Well, you're saying that basically, even if we are pursuing denuclearization, we need to ensure also the Korean peninsula, and that's very important. I think I agree with all of that. Undermining our own security does not necessarily increase, DPRK's trust in Korea's sincerity. And so even if there is denuclearization taking place, there's always this variability of intent and military actions going forward. So peace and security always is a balancing act that will continue. So we need to continue to have our deterrence policy to guarantee our own security. So before we are able to achieve a complete peaceful regime on the Korean peninsula, we need to have deterrence measures. And an important part of that deterrence is communication. So we need to have transparent communication. So our security strategy should be pursued in parallel with denuclearization negotiations. And of course, the nuclear umbrella is one of those deterrence policies. Of course, there could be potentially a South Korean development of nuclear program that's been suggested by some, but I think that's not advisable. Because, we may end up decoupling between Korea and U.S., and once that decoupling takes place, would U.S. risk, its mainland security to support Korea? So it's very important to have more joint integrated efforts between Korea and U.S. So we need to have a stronger Korean-U.S. alliance. And secondly, with regards to guaranteeing security for North Korea from a military security, that is not something that's possible. Even if DPRK were able to have U.S. sign a peace treaty, and even if the nuclear weapons could be withdrawn from this region, the U.S. has the capability to strike from its mainland also. So the DPRK is aware of this, and so Kim Yo-jong's statement, it has proposed requirements to talks. It doesn't mean that there she's intimating that there needs to be some, reliable guarantee of security for North Korea, although she acknowledges that it cannot be a perfect guarantee. And we have talked about maybe an end of war declaration and peace treaty, but we have not achieved meaningful progress. And so under the circumstances, just providing some sort of economic rewards or compensation will not in and of itself be enough to have DPRK come to the table. Of course, that can be part of the offer. And with regards to your earlier question, yes, it is important to have some sort of guarantee of military security, but the more important aspect is to have a longer-term approach to engage North Korea to become a normal state, recognizable by the international community, to provide North Korea with the possibility that there can be a better future. Instead of just providing offers that are more conceptual and very abstract, we need to provide more concrete vision and blueprint for a more peaceful peninsula. And you talked about the confederation stage. I think it is very important for us to have a more detailed and concrete plan for the confederation stage. Right now, because there hasn't been denuclearization, we have not really developed that picture yet. But we need to, of course, make progress in reconciliation and cooperation in order to proceed to a confederation stage. Right now, we have only developed some plans for early stage of the confederation phase, but we have not really fully developed that plan. And Brooks talked about North Korea Fund. That's a very concrete proposal. But before denuclearization, no money would be provided to North Korea. But by creating that North Korea fund that shows North Korea that we are really committed. Of course, this kind of concrete measure should go hand in hand with providing some sort of military security. The U.S. and China's strong political will is very important. Because if they feel that maintaining the status quo geopolitically is more advantageous for them, we cannot make progress. They would be satisfied with just maintaining the status quo. But trust should be driven by shared strategic outlook. So we can't not just rely on building some sort of psychological trust. There needs to be some concrete vision strategically that is shared in order to establish meaningful trust. And that's something that Korea should really take on. Of course, it's very challenging. And so, overcoming partisanship is very important. In the Trump administration, there has been a lot of distrust between the U.S. and North Korea, and we need to engage in diplomacy towards U.S. so that they can have a better understanding of DPRK, and we also need to provide more integrated and consensual voice towards North Korea so that towards U.S. For better results.
부탁합니다.
Thank you, Professor Shin. It was very interesting to hear the other presentations and questions and comments made by the discussants. The others spoke about a more higher level, and a lot of what was discussed by you came up during the discussions with the North Korean defectors. How are we going to integrate our society well with North Korea? Of course, it will take a very long time, and we are a society that cannot even enable integration with the immigrants here in Korea, because there is a regionalism in Korea, and for certain groups of people, we have hatred toward them, and there is hierarchy, and in our society, certain emotions are expressed to certain groups of people. And if we open up in this situation, this will be exacerbated. It will lead to a very difficult situation. When I first went to New Malden to go for the field study, there was great anger and great hatred. There were the employees that said that they could not understand the employers, and the employers could not understand the employees, and that they were being abused. We should not be. You asked about the North Koreans not being ashamed of their identity. You can't be completely proud of or completely ashamed of your background and identity. It's influenced. The North Korean defectors in the UK, they could be on par to a certain extent with the South Koreans, because South Korean immigrants, the North Korean defectors, felt that they also betrayed their country. So North Korean defectors felt ashamed that they had betrayed their country and they came to UK and they saw other South Koreans, they viewed them as betrayers of South Korea. And those who have experience selling in Changmadang, they prefer capitalism. And South Koreans' method utilizing illegal activities in capitalism, they compare that to it and they feel prouder about themselves. And nuclear issue, when it arose, and in the Western media, it was covered intensively, and some felt proud that North Korea had power. But on the other hand, some were saying that they were ashamed because North Korea was a problem maker in international society. So what I'm saying is that institution-wise and in the legal system, what is being recognized has a big influence on the feeling of their identity. North Korean defectors, it's a bit ambiguous because Ministry of Unification also feels hesitant to acknowledge and recognize North Korean defectors because they feel that those who have left South Korea, the North Korean defectors who have left South Korea, may be perceived as a failure for South Korea's assimilation efforts. And we should be more at ease when we view these North Korean defectors that have left South Korea. And when China opened up, there were those who had left China, and these people had learned overseas. They had networks established, and it was used when China opened up their economy. In the future, of course, in the long term, we need to establish institutions and make legal frameworks. And North Korean defectors, they move around a lot. Some go to Toronto, and due to certain institutions and systems, they go back to Korea, and then they go somewhere else. In the U.S., they don't have a good welfare system, and the social atmosphere, they consider North Korea as the axis of evil. That is why North Koreans living in U.S., they have a high level of suicide rate and they feel lonely. It's different from the atmosphere of North Korean defectors living in UK. It's about the media and socially how welcome they are. And it's about their encounters in daily life. So in addition to legal framework improvement, there should be capacity building. Thank you very much.
박 교수님
Professor Park and Han, I gave you grand questions, and yet I cannot give you a lot of time. I apologize for that. Could you provide us with your thoughts briefly?
Dr. Park first, please. You're on mute. You're on mute, so apologies. Sustainable policies on North Korea, overcoming the differences between Korea, Japan, and U.S. was your question. Well, I think most important thing is to first have a consensus in Korea, really to have a consensus view on our policies toward North Korea. And it has to be very realistic, and it has to be concrete, and also it has to be universal. And Korea likes to be in the driver's seat, but then it tries to divert the risk-taking to other parties at the table. So we really need to come up with an alternative that can persuade the others. And we should not see North Korean issues just as an inter-Korean issue. We should see this in the broader regional and global context. And we should see that turning North Korea into a more normal state that is recognized internationally, that is important to solving all issues concerning North Korea. But right now, we just keep looking at this as an inter-Korean issue and really need to break away from that limited framework framework. And Dr. John already talked about this, but I think we're just too bilateral right now. So bilateralism is important when we want to really break through an issue, but ultimately we really need to have a multilateral approach in providing offers of compensation and whatnot. But we really need to have some more healthier combination of the bilateral and the multilateral approach in dealing with this. Thank you.
님,
Thank you, Professor Han now. I agree to Professor Park's comments on the grand level. We want unification, but we focus on conflict, and there are policy preferences and individual experiences that lead to the differences, and economic interests also may lead to a difference in individuals having conflicting opinions with others on North Korean policies. So North Korean policies hold in it factors of conflict, and parties in Korea and the National Assembly utilize North Korean policies as their strategy to divide the country. But this is not just a problem experienced by South Korea. As National Assembly and lawmakers, this is a natural phenomenon. But the problem is when North Korean issues is used to mobilize people, and it will lead to certain outcomes, leading to policies or getting preferences from citizens. And in the process of this happening, the key discussion points here, we did not provide proper knowledge to the voters, and various alternatives were not communicated to the people. At one point, it becomes an issue, but later on, the actual issue, the substance disappears, and the policy itself is no longer discussed, and it just becomes a matter of supporting one side over the other. And this is a problem in Korea. So for sustainable North Korean policy, just as Professor Park said, we need to have a common agreement. Of course, the entire society cannot come to a consensus, but at least the majority should come to a consensus that can be embraced and accepted by most. And this should become an institute. And for this to happen, we have to frequently communicate this to the citizens, and this should be objectively reviewed and managed to manage crisis and conflict situations more objectively. And we need systems to make this possible, especially for North Korean policies and unification policies. The Ministry of Unification needs to play that role, and we need to reflect on whether the Ministry of Unification is fully providing this role. The Ministry of Unification needs to think about social integration society's consensus on this matter.
다섯 분 모두 대단히
Thank you very much. All the presenters and the discussants, we have gone over 5 minutes over our original schedule, so we really need to end this session here. The Seoul National University's Institute for Peace and Unification Studies have organized this, and the 5 speakers and discussants have really shared wisdom and great insights. So thank you very much. Through more academic events, we need to continue the sharing of insights. We have people logging in, both from domestic and from overseas. So I thank you all for joining us. And of course, this was not in the plans yet, but just something that I remembered. Wednesday next week, that's 16th. Dr. Park is the director of the GSIS, and at the International Studies Institute at the GSIS, it will have a seminar dealing with geopolitical issues concerning Korean Peninsula and strategies. So there is an academic event that will be held on the 16th of September at the SNU GSIS. So please visit their website, and you will probably be able to join in the discussion through a YouTube channel. Right now the weather has cleared up. It's a beautiful day today, and I hope you enjoy delicious lunch along with the wonderful weather. And once again, I thank the presenters and the discussants and all those who have been watching the presentations and the discussion. I wish you all health. With this, I would like to conclude the session. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.